Hi everyone. This video covers Anselm's Proslogion chapters 1 and 2, which contain Anselm's ontological argument for the existence of God. This was written back in 1079 of the Common Era, and Anselm never uses the term ontological, and it's not even clear that he means this to be an argument, but philosophers, ever since Kant at least, have attributed the ontological argument to Anselm. So let's go ahead and jump in here. I'm going to look at some of the highlights and offer some explanation along the way. He says, "We believe that thou art somewhat than which no greater can be conceived." So this is his definition of God. What is God? That than which no greater can be conceived. In other words, God is the greatest conceivable being. You can't imagine anything greater than God. That's his definition. He continues, "Yet surely even the fool himself, when he hears me speak," okay, let's just clarify. The fool here is the person in the Bible, which is in Psalms 14:1. So that person is called a fool there, and that's the person he's referring to there. In this passage, he says, "That person who hears me speak of somewhat than which nothing greater can be conceived understands what he hears, and what he understands in his understanding, even if he do not understand that it really exists. It is one thing for a thing to be in the understanding and another to understand that the thing really exists." So this person doesn't believe God exists in reality, but has no problem understanding the idea of God in his mind. Let's continue. He says, "And surely that than which no greater can be conceived cannot exist only in the understanding, for if it exists indeed in the understanding only, it can be thought to exist also in reality." Why? Let me explain. So if existence is a good thing and a perfect thing, and this idea you have in mind is of the most perfect thing or the greatest conceivable thing, then doesn't that idea in your mind also have the characteristic of existence too? He continues, "If then that than which no greater can be conceived exists in the understanding only, then that than which no greater can be conceived is something a greater than which can be conceived, but this is impossible." So to insist that that idea only remains in one's mind, even though you admit that existence is a good thing and the greatest conceivable being would have existence, that would be a contradiction, that would be impossible. Therefore, he says, "It is certain that something than which no greater can be conceived exists both in the understanding and also in reality." So therefore, God exists not just in the mind, but also outside of the mind. Chapter 3. Okay, so he says, not only does this something than which no greater can be conceived exist, in other words, God exists, but it exists in so true a sense that it cannot even be conceived not to exist. In other words, it's in the very definition of God being the greatest conceivable being that God exists. He says, "Wherefore, if that than which no greater can be conceived not to exist, it follows that that than which no greater can be conceived is not that than which no greater can be conceived," and this is a contradiction. So in other words, he's saying that if you can imagine in your mind a being that's the greatest conceivable being, but admit that that being has existence, then it must also exist outside of the mind on pain of contradiction. He says, "Thus it is proved that that thing than which no greater can be conceived exists in so true a sense that it cannot even be conceived not to exist." All right. So I hope that was helpful. Those explanations were shed a little bit of light on this difficult passage. I want to read one other thing. This comes from Alistair McGrath's Christian Theology Reader. He says, in explaining Anselm's point, he says, "The crux of Anselm's point is this: the idea of something is inferior to its reality. It therefore follows, according to Anselm, that the idea of God as that than which nothing greater can be conceived contains a contradiction, because the reality of God would be superior to this idea. In other words, if this definition of God is correct and exists in the human mind, then the corresponding reality must also exist." I hope you found that helpful.